point, and it's been for a better part of the last 2 decades or more in this country. Well, the Center for Development and Enterprise says South Africa cannot afford a basic income grant. The center says while it notes that poverty rates are exceptionally high, adding a large and permanent new spending program will only make things worse for our finances. To discuss this, I'm joined now by the center's executive director, Bernstein. Thank you for joining me. And so, until now, much of what I've been hearing in the public discourse around the basic income grant has been the argument that says it's not about whether we can afford it. It's a question of we can't afford not to have it, given the number of people who fall through the cracks despite an extensive social security system. You are saying we absolutely cannot afford it.
Well, Thulasizwe, it's good to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity. Poverty in South Africa is horrific. In 2014, the statistics told us that 55% of people, of the whole population, were living in poverty. If you think of everything that's happened since then, we're convinced that it's well over 60% of the population today. This is terrible. But what we do about this is something where you need to keep a cool head. So there are people saying we should just raise the taxes and somehow find additional money, 200 to 300 billion rand per annum, to pay for a basic income grant of about 800 rand a month or more for all unemployed adults or all adults in the workforce who are poor. Now, the problem is raising taxes has a big price, not just the tax itself, but the consequences of doing that. And if you don't raise those taxes, which will inevitably slow growth, you have to add to South Africa's debt. And we have something like 70% of our GDP is now, our debt is 70% of our GDP. And it's rising, and we've had one of the steepest rises of anybody. So the country's already in a fiscal crisis. Our current expenditure is unaffordable. So this is not a question of, do you care about the poor? Of course we do. Of course we would like to help. But we have to get growth going, which will be labor intensive and increase our tax revenues, and then perhaps we can help the poor more than we are already.
So let me get this straight then, Anne. Is your main concern that to fund the basic income grant, government would have to borrow even more despite the precarious state of our public finances, as you cite, debt to GDP, which is well over 80% at the moment. So if we could find a way to fund it without having to borrow, you'd be okay with it?
Well, if we had an endless supply of money, of course one would want to help people in desperate need. But the truth is we can't borrow to pay for this. We can't print money, which some people are suggesting, because that would be a massive negative signal. It would lead to increased inflation, and the poor will suffer the most from higher inflation.
So what do you say to
some
those?
People say, well, why don't we cut the budget?
Yeah.
But we're already cutting expenditure in the budget. We're cutting expenditure for the last 2 years on basic education, on policing, on all sorts of other critical functions. So our budget, we're already in a fiscal crisis, but it's not one event, it's a process. So we don't see where you could get the money from. What we are saying is let's get growth going first, and then one can look at perhaps helping more. But there's another point which we need to bear in mind. South Africa has a progressive tax system, and we gear our budget already to help poorer people. We spend over half our expenditure on what's called the social wage, from free education to housing, et cetera, So, but the problem is we have well-targeted grants to 18.4 million people, but the other parts of our redistributive spending we are not getting value for our money. So we should be looking at how we get much better value for poor people from all our attempts at redistribution.
What do you say, Anne Bernstein, to the argument that says we simply don't have the choice? We simply don't have the choice. It's an argument that's been advanced by such people as Mark Haywood, for example, saying that, quote unquote, the basic income grant is not a policy choice for the government in South Africa. It is a policy mandate. It is a positive obligation. What we have at the moment is an unlawful situation in terms of what the Constitution requires we do to ensure equality and to ensure a flow of socio-economic rights. He's referencing there Section 27 of the Constitution, which I don't need to recite back to you, because a lot of people would say that section that talks about social security in instances where people can't afford to support themselves or their loved ones and their families was written with this exact situation in mind. And all we need to do perhaps is to improve efficiencies and fulfill this mandate in the Constitution.
I wish it were that simple. We have to talk about, if you want to talk about fundamental issues, I think the country is in a deep, deep hole. We're in a national emergency on every front, and that requires the government to respond differently. We need much more competent people in our cabinet. We need to deal with corruption, and we need to spend the money we have with much greater effect. Now, you can stand on your head. I can want to fly to the moon, but I can't do that. So the issue is one of, if we were to introduce a big and pay for it through taxes, we will harm economic growth, we will increase unemployment. Sure. If we do it through raising our debt, we will harm economic growth and we will increase unemployment.
I get that argument, and I guess what I'm asking you is, right now, between national, provincial and local government, we are creeping up on close to 100 billion rand in fruitless, irregular and wasteful expenditure. Some people are saying if we were to clamp down on that and reprioritize that, that would take us some way.
Look, I'm in favor of clamping down on bad expenditure. I'd start with all the ministers' fancy cars, for one, and their security. I don't see why their lives are more important than ours, other than the president. But that's not going to get you 200 billion rand per annum. Mm-hmm. So this is a real dilemma. But what we're saying is, if you are to proceed with a basic income grant, you're going to take a gamble with South Africa's future. And that isn't because we don't care about poverty or the desperate situation people are in. We think that going down that road is going to make things worse.
Right. And I'm completely out of time. I'm completely out of time. Let me ask you this question, though. Are your reservations about the affordability of the basic income grant based on the level at which it's pitched by some sectors of civil society who obviously have to pitch it higher? But could it be that, as you talk about an extra 200 billion rand, that perhaps if you thought of it the way that the Taylor Commission thought of it in 2004 and said, basically, if you gave everyone 100 rand a month, and we've seen the evidence from the Social Relief of Distress grant of grant pooling, that many, many households, poor households, there's pooling of grants. So if the uncle gets 100 rand and the mother gets 100 rand and the father gets 100 rand, the household has 300 rand, and 300 rand can go a long way. So could it be that you're working off the higher end of the argument, whereas actually there are alternatives on the lower end, which wouldn't come up to the 200 billion rand that you are talking about?
Look, obviously where you pitch it affects how much we have to raise. I agree with you. The proposals on the table and being debated hotly in government at the moment come from the Department of Social Development and the report they brought out, and from a number of other NGOs. And none of them are at 100 rand per person. They're all there seems to be some consensus around 800 Rand and more. Nobody is talking about the 100 Rand per person. So that is not on the table. Think of it this way, the 350 Rand we're giving people for the last more or less 2 years, the social relief of distress grant is about 44 billion Rand per annum. If you say there are about 10 million people getting it. But nobody's talking about 100 Rand. That's not what's on the table at the moment.
Yeah. All right. No, I've got to thank you for your time. And we could have this debate, throughout the night and not sleep and continue to talk about it. As I said, it's been raging for the past 2.5 decades and it doesn't seem to be abating. All we are getting is that, there's a serious conversation that says we should seriously explore the feasibility. And so that's one of the views that's on the table. And Bernstein there from the Center for Development and Enterprise weighing in on the affordability of the basic income grant. Let me shift focus to this now. The National Liquor Traders Council has written an open